The name that came out of Damien Cross's mouth was not Elena Voss, and the moment it left his lips, the entire hall seemed to tilt beneath her feet. Serafina Hart will stand beside me as Luna of the Blackthorn Pack. Elena did not move. She did not blink. Around her, hundreds of pack members erupted into applause, a wall of sound that crashed over her like water closing above her head. She stood near the front of the crowd, in a deep green gown she had chosen carefully that morning, believing, with the foolish certainty of someone who had never once questioned the sun rising, that tonight would be the night everything she had waited for finally arrived. Instead, she watched Serafina step forward in gold, smiling as though she had won a prize rather than been handed one. Elena's hands were folded in front of her, fingers laced so tightly that her knuckles had turned the color of bone. She kept her spine straight. She kept her chin level. Years of training had taught her how to take a hit without flinching, how to absorb pain in her body without letting her face reveal it, and she called on every hour of that training now, standing perfectly still, while the foundation of her entire future collapsed in front of 300 witnesses. She had known Damien since she was 7 years old. She had grown up in the shadow of his family's power, trained beside him in the yards where pack children learned to fight before they learned to read, bled beside him during trials that tested every child born into Blackthorn blood. She had believed, without ever needing him to say the words aloud, that the quiet moments between them meant something. The way his hand found hers without thought during long council sessions, the way he trusted her judgment over the council of men 3 times his age, the way he looked at her when he thought no one else was watching. She had been wrong about every part of it. Serafina crossed the space between them and the throne with unhurried steps, savoring the attention, the torchlight catching the gold thread of her dress and throwing it back in flickers across the stone walls. The hall smelled of pine and burning wood and the sharp, celebratory scent of pack members whose wolves had risen close to the surface in the excitement of the moment. Somewhere behind Elena, a drum began to beat, slow and ceremonial, marking the formal joining of Alpha and future Luna. She heard laughter. She heard someone calling out a blessing. She heard none of it as anything more than noise, pressing against the outside of a glass wall that had suddenly dropped down around her, sealing her off from the celebration entirely. She made herself walk forward. It was the hardest thing she had ever done, harder than any trial, harder than any fight she had survived in the training yards as a girl. But the pack was watching, and Elena understood with brutal clarity that the version of this night she carried forward into the rest of her life would be decided in the next few seconds. If she broke here, in front of everyone, that image would follow her forever. She refused to give them that. She reached Serafina and offered a small, correct bow. "Congratulations," she said. Her voice came out steady, almost warm. "May your bond bring strength to this pack." Serafina's eyes flickered, something sharp and pleased moving behind them, before she smoothed it into practiced grace. "Thank you, Elena. That means a great deal, coming from you." There was a blade hidden inside those words, wrapped in silk so no one else in the hall would notice the cut. Elena felt it anyway, straight through the ribs. Everyone knew. Perhaps not the details, not the years of quiet hope she had carried, but everyone in that hall understood enough to recognize what this moment cost her, and Serafina's small, knowing smile confirmed that she understood it best of all. Damien did not look at her. His eyes had already moved past her, toward the crowd surging forward to offer congratulations, toward the musicians beginning to play again, toward a night that belonged entirely to someone else now. Elena stood in the middle of the celebration like a stone dropped into a river, motion rushing past her on every side while she remained fixed and frozen at its center. She did not cry. She smiled at pack elders who approached to offer kind words about her own future. Words meant to soften a humiliation everyone could see plainly on the surface, even if no one spoke of it directly. She accepted a cup of wine she had no intention of drinking. She laughed once, briefly, at something a young cousin said to her, a sound that came out hollow even to her own ears. And slowly, carefully, without appearing to hurry, she began working her way toward the edge of the hall. Walter sat near the great doors, in the same worn chair he had occupied every night for 40 years, guarding the entrance more out of habit and loyalty than any real necessity. His eyes had clouded with age, but his hearing remained sharp enough to catch footsteps most others would have missed in the noise of celebration. He looked up as Elena approached, and something in her face made him set down the small cup of tea he had been nursing. "Leaving the celebration already?" he asked, his voice pitched low enough that it would not carry. "I need air," Elena said. It was not entirely a lie. Walter studied her for a long moment. He had watched her grow from a child who scraped her knees in the training yard and refused to cry, into the composed young woman standing before him now, still refusing, even at the worst moment of her life, to let anyone see her break. "You are stronger than most people in that hall will ever understand," he said quietly. Something in his words nearly cracked the careful wall she had built around herself in the last 10 minutes. Elena swallowed hard, and managed a small, real smile, the only honest expression she had offered anyone since Damien said Serafina's name. "Tell him I said thank you," she said. She did not explain who she meant, or for what. Walter did not ask. He simply nodded, as though he understood anyway, and watched her step through the great doors and out into the cold night air beyond the torchlight. She did not look back. The night outside the hall was sharp and clear, stars scattered thickly across a sky, untouched by cloud, the kind of night that would have felt beautiful to her only hours earlier. Now it felt merely indifferent, vast and uncaring, stretching endlessly above a world that had just rearranged itself around her without asking permission. Elena walked quickly across the courtyard, her slippers cold against the stone, until she reached the private wing where her chambers waited, quiet and untouched, exactly as she had left them that morning, when she still believed her future held something entirely different. She stood in the doorway for a long moment before stepping inside. Her room looked the same as it always had. A narrow bed with a woven blanket her grandmother had made before she died. A small writing desk beneath the window, stacked with ledgers and reports she had been managing for the PAX Council. A smooth gray stone sitting on the corner of the desk, small and unremarkable to anyone who did not know its history, but to Elena it represented an entire summer, one she had spent almost every day of at Damien's side, when they were both 12 years old, wading through the shallow river at the northern edge of PAC territory, catching fish with their bare hands, and losing every single time, laughing until their sides ached. He had found the stone at the bottom of that river and pressed it into her palm, telling her it would bring her luck. She had carried it with her for 11 years. She picked it up now, turned it over once in her fingers, and set it back down. Then she began to pack. She did not take jewelry. She did not take the fine dresses hanging carefully in her wardrobe, gifts from PAC elders who had once believed, along with everyone else, that she was destined for a future at Damien's side. She took practical things instead: sturdy boots meant for long travel, several changes of simple clothing, the modest savings she had accumulated over years of careful management, and a small blade she had carried since her first combat trial at age 14. She moved through the room with mechanical efficiency, refusing to let herself think too deeply about what she was doing, understanding on some instinctive level that if she paused long enough to fully consider the weight of this decision, she might lose the courage to see it through. Only once did she stop entirely still, standing in the center of her room, with her packed bag already resting against the door, staring at the writing desk where a blank sheet of parchment sat waiting. She had planned to write a different letter tonight. Earlier that evening, before the coronation, before Serafina's name had shattered everything she believed about her future, Elena had imagined sitting at this very desk, composing a joyful farewell to her old life, as she prepared to formally step into the role of Luna. She had imagined thanking the elders who raised her, promising to serve the PAC faithfully in her new position, perhaps even leaving a private note for Damien himself, something warm and hopeful about the future they would build together. Instead, she picked up her pen and wrote something else entirely. The letter she composed was brief and controlled, giving nothing away beyond the barest necessary explanation. She thanked the PAC elders for their guidance throughout her life. She explained that she needed time away, that she trusted they would understand, and that she wished the PAC continued strength and prosperity under its new leadership. She did not mention Damien by name. She did not mention Serafina at all. When she finished, she read the letter once, folded it precisely in half, and set it on the desk where it would be easily found. She weighted it down with the smooth gray stone. She would not need reminders of a life that no longer included her, and she understood, with a clarity that surprised her, that leaving the stone behind was itself a kind of answer to a question She had never been brave enough to ask him directly. If he ever found the letter, if he ever wondered what had become of her, the stone left behind would tell him everything words could not. Elena lifted her bag, took one final look at the room that had held every version of herself she had ever been, and walked out through the door without allowing herself to hesitate again. The pack's private wing was quiet at this hour, most residents still occupied with the celebration continuing in the great hall behind her. She moved through empty corridors with the careful, silent steps her combat training had drilled into her since childhood, avoiding the main courtyard where guards still stood watch, choosing instead a narrow servants' passage that led toward the northern gate. She had used this passage countless times as a child, sneaking out with Damien to explore the forest beyond pack boundaries when they were both far too young to be given that kind of freedom. Tonight, she used it alone, and the irony of that fact settled into her chest like a stone of its own. The northern gate stood mostly unwatched at this hour, the guards assigned to it having drifted toward the celebration despite standing orders against exactly that kind of lapse. Elena slipped through without incident, and within minutes, the stone walls of Blackthorn territory had disappeared behind her, swallowed by darkness and distance. The forest welcomed her the way it always had, ancient and indifferent, filled with sounds that would have unsettled anyone raised outside its boundaries but felt as familiar to Elena as her own heartbeat. She knew these paths from 100 childhood expeditions, knew which routes would catch an unwary foot, knew where the ground grew soft and treacherous after rainfall, knew the fastest route toward the territory's edge, without needing to consciously think through any of it. Her body simply moved, carrying her forward, while her mind remained locked somewhere back in that hall, replaying the moment Damien's voice had shattered everything she believed about her future. She thought about turning back more than once during that long walk through darkness. She thought about how easy it would be to return to her chambers, unpack her bag, wake tomorrow morning as though nothing had changed, and simply endure whatever pain remained buried beneath a mask of composure for as long as necessary. Pack life had taught her that endurance, more than almost anything else. She could survive this. She had survived worse. But every time the thought surfaced, she heard Serafina's name again, echoing through that crowded hall, and her feet kept carrying her forward instead of back. The night grew colder as she climbed toward higher ground, her breath forming small clouds in the moonlight, her boots growing damp from crossing a shallow stream she remembered fording dozens of times as a child, always with Damien somewhere close beside her. She did not allow herself to dwell on those memories now. She simply kept walking, one careful step after another, putting distance between herself and everything she had once believed her life would become. Somewhere around midnight, she stopped briefly to rest beside the base of an old oak tree that marked the unofficial boundary between pack hunting grounds and unclaimed forest beyond. She sat with her back against its rough bark, pulling her knees up toward her chest, and for the first time since leaving the hall, allowed herself a single, ragged breath that came dangerously close to becoming a sob before she forced it back down. She would not fall apart here, alone in the dark forest, with no one to witness it, and nothing gained by the release. She would save that grief for later, for somewhere safer, somewhere far enough removed from pack territory, that breaking down would not risk discovery or rescue by scouts who might come looking once her absence was noticed. For now, she needed to keep moving. She rose, adjusted the strap of her bag across her shoulder, and continued forward. Dawn found her at the edge of pack territory, standing at the top of a low ridge overlooking a narrow dirt road that wound down toward the distant lights of a human settlement she had visited only a handful of times in her life, always accompanied by trade delegations negotiating resources with human merchants. She had always found those brief visits strange and fascinating, glimpses into a world that operated entirely without the rigid hierarchy, an inherited destiny that shaped every decision within pack structure. Tonight, standing alone at the boundary between everything familiar and everything unknown, that strangeness felt less like curiosity and more like possibility. The sky behind her had begun turning gray with the first hints of morning light, and somewhere back within pack territory, the celebration would finally be winding down, exhausted revelers stumbling toward their beds, unaware that one guest had already vanished into the night and would not be returning with the dawn. Elena looked once more at the forest behind her, at the world she had known every single day of her life, at the pack that had raised her and trained her and, in the end, chosen someone else to stand at its head beside the man she had loved since childhood. Then she turned away from it entirely, adjusted her bag one final time, and began walking down the ridge, toward the distant lights of the human town, toward a future she could not yet imagine, carrying nothing with her but practical necessities, a small blade, and a resolve that had hardened into something unbreakable, somewhere during that long, cold walk through darkness. She did not look back again. Behind her, within the stone halls of Blackthorn territory, morning arrived slowly for a pack still recovering from a night of celebration. Servants moved quietly through corridors preparing breakfast. Guards changed shifts at the gates, none of them aware that one had failed to notice a young woman slipping past hours earlier. And in the private wing, where pack members of standing kept their chambers, a folded letter sat waiting on an empty desk, weighted down by a smooth gray stone, patient and silent, holding within it an answer that would not be discovered until well past midday, when the celebration's aftermath had finally cleared enough for anyone to notice that Elena Voss was nowhere to be found. The road down from the ridge took longer than Elena expected, the packed dirt uneven beneath her boots, winding through low hills dotted with scrub brush that gave way slowly to farmland as she descended. She passed a wooden fence marking the edge of someone's property, then a barn with its doors standing open, a rooster somewhere inside announcing the morning with more enthusiasm than the gray light outside seemed to warrant. She kept walking, her legs aching now from a night without rest, her stomach tight and empty in a way that had nothing to do with hunger and everything to do with the hollow space where her future used to sit. By the time she reached the outskirts of the town, the sun had fully risen, casting long shadows across streets that were only beginning to stir with early activity. A baker somewhere nearby had already lit ovens, and the smell of bread drifted toward her, warm and strange and entirely unlike anything she associated with home. She had eaten human food before, during trade visits, but she had never smelled it prepared fresh at dawn, never stood alone on an unfamiliar street, with nowhere in particular to go, and no one waiting for her arrival. A woman swept the front step of a shop a few doors down, her sleeves rolled to the elbow, humming something under her breath as she worked. She glanced up as Elena passed, taking in the travel-worn state of her clothing, the exhaustion written plainly across her face despite her efforts to hold herself with dignity. "You look like you've walked all night," the woman said, not unkindly. "I have," Elena admitted, too tired in that moment to construct anything more elaborate than the truth. The woman studied her a moment longer, then set her broom against the doorframe. "There's a bakery 2 streets over that rents rooms above the shop," she said. "Cheap, but clean. Tell the owner Margaret sent you. She'll treat you fair." Elena thanked her, more grateful for the small kindness than she expected to be, and continued walking in the direction the woman had pointed. She found the bakery exactly where Margaret had described, its windows still dark, a hand-painted sign swinging gently above the door. She knocked, uncertain whether anyone would answer at such an early hour, and waited on the step with her bag heavy against her shoulder, and her whole body aching with the particular exhaustion that comes from grief carried too long without rest. When the door finally opened, a sharp-eyed woman, in a flour-dusted apron, looked her over, without any pretense of subtlety. "We're not open yet," she said. "I'm not here for bread," Elena said. "Margaret sent me. I understand you rent rooms." The woman's expression shifted slightly, curiosity replacing suspicion. "I do," she said. "Come in out of the cold before you fall over. You look like you haven't slept in a week." Elena stepped inside, the warmth of the ovens already working somewhere in the back of the shop, wrapping around her like something almost forgotten. The woman introduced herself as Priya, led her up a narrow staircase to a small room above the bakery, plain but clean, with a single window overlooking the street below, and named a price that Elena's remaining savings could manage for several months if she was careful. "What's your name?" Priya asked, watching her carefully as Elena set her bag down on the narrow bed. Elena hesitated for only a moment. The name she had carried her entire life belonged to a world she had just walked away from, to a family and a pack and a history that felt, standing in this small, unfamiliar room, like it belonged to someone else entirely. "Elena Cole," she said. It was the first time she spoke the name aloud, and something in her chest settled slightly as she said it, as though trying it out had confirmed something she had not yet consciously decided. Priya nodded, apparently satisfied, and left her alone to rest. Elena sat on the edge of the narrow bed for a long time after the door closed, staring at bare walls that held no memories, no history, nothing familiar at all. She thought about the pack, about the coronation, about the sound of applause that had swallowed her whole just hours earlier. She thought about Damien's face, calm and certain as he spoke Serafina's name, and she wondered, with a bitterness that surprised her, how she had misread him so completely for so many years. She allowed herself to cry then, finally, alone in a room, where no one knew her name or her history, where no one would witness her grief or judge her for it. She cried until her chest ached, and her eyes burned raw, releasing years of quiet hope, in a single storm, that left her hollowed out and exhausted, in a way that had nothing left to do with sleep deprivation. By the time the tears stopped, something new had settled into the space they left behind. It was not quite anger, though anger lived somewhere within it. It was not quite ambition either, though ambition would grow from it in time. It was something closer to resolve, quiet and steady, settling into her bones with a weight that felt, for the first time since the coronation hall, almost like solid ground beneath her feet. She would not go back. Not as the woman who had been left behind, not as someone whose worth had been measured and found wanting by an alpha king choosing political convenience over years of quiet devotion. If she ever returned to face the pack again, it would be as someone entirely new, someone whose value could not be dismissed by anyone else's decision. Elena washed her face in the small basin beside the bed, changed into simple clothing that would draw no particular attention on the streets below, and sat for a while longer simply breathing, letting the exhaustion of the night settle into something more manageable than grief. Outside her window, the town continued waking around her, entirely unaware that a woman with a story it would never know had just arrived among its streets, carrying nothing but a bag of practical belongings and a determination that had not yet found its shape. Tomorrow, she told herself, she would begin looking for work. Tomorrow, she would start building whatever came next. Tonight, for the first time since the applause had swallowed her whole, she allowed herself simply to rest. The morning after the coronation, the pack woke slowly, most of its members nursing the pleasant exhaustion of celebration, rather than any sense that something had gone wrong. It was not until midday, when a young messenger arrived at Elena's chambers carrying routine council business, that anyone realized her absence was more than a late morning of rest. The messenger knocked twice, received no answer, and finally pushed the door open to find the room empty, the bed untouched, a folded letter sitting on the desk weighted down by a small gray stone. He read enough of the letter to understand its weight, then ran through the corridors to find someone with authority to act on what he had discovered. Word spread through the pack with the particular speed reserved for scandal and misfortune. By evening, everyone from the elder council to the youngest pack initiate knew that Elena Voss had vanished sometime during the night, leaving behind only a brief note requesting time away. Theories multiplied quickly in the absence of clear information. Some whispered that heartbreak had driven her to run, unable to bear witnessing Damien's new life with Serafina. Others suggested darker possibilities, that she had been taken against her will, that something sinister had befallen her somewhere in the forest, between the pack walls and the outside world. Marcus refused to believe either explanation. He had known Elena since childhood, had trained beside her and Damien both in the same yards, had watched her endure injuries and setbacks that would have broken most warriors without ever once seeing her run from difficulty. The idea that she would simply vanish because of a broken heart, however genuine that heartbreak might be, did not match the woman he had known his entire life. He found Damien late that evening in his private study, a glass of wine sitting untouched on the desk before him, his expression distant, in a way Marcus had rarely seen from his closest friend. "You've heard," Marcus said. It was not a question. Damien nodded slowly. "The council believes she left because of heartbreak. Do you believe that?" Damien turned the wine glass slowly in his hand, without drinking from it. "I don't know what to believe," he admitted. "Elena has never run from anything difficult in her life. She stood beside me through negotiations that would have broken lesser advisors. She trained through injuries most warriors would have used as an excuse to rest. The idea that she simply disappeared because of hurt feelings doesn't match anything I know about her character." "Then what does?" Marcus asked. Damien set the glass down without answering immediately, his jaw tight with something that looked, to Marcus's careful eye, uncomfortably close to guilt. "I don't know," he said finally, "but I intend to find out." He ordered scouts into the forest that same night, tracking Elena's scent along the paths leading away from pack territory. The trail proved easier to follow than expected at first, clear and consistent through the forest itself, but it grew increasingly difficult once it reached the outskirts of the human settlement at the territory's edge, where countless unfamiliar scents mixed together and swallowed any trace of a single individual within hours of her passing through. The scouts returned 3 days later with nothing conclusive to report. Damien sent them out again, further this time, questioning merchants and travelers who might have seen a young woman matching Elena's description passing through on foot. Still nothing solid emerged, only vague, unreliable accounts that led nowhere useful. Days stretched into weeks. Elena did not return, and no further trace of her whereabouts surfaced, despite Damien's continued efforts. Serafina, meanwhile, settled into her new role as Luna, with practiced confidence, attending council sessions, greeting pack members with careful warmth, and gradually beginning to reshape certain traditions according to her own preferences. She was undeniably capable, sharp-minded in ways that impressed the elder council during difficult negotiations, but something in her approach felt colder than what pack members had grown accustomed to under previous leadership. Where Elena had always taken time to understand every perspective before rendering judgment on difficult matters, Serafina moved with quick, calculated efficiency that occasionally left pack members feeling unheard. Damien noticed the difference more than he wanted to admit, though he told himself repeatedly that comparing Serafina to Elena was both unfair and unnecessary. Every new Luna required time to find her footing within pack structure. It would be foolish to judge her too harshly during these early months. Still, during council sessions, he sometimes found his gaze drifting toward the seat where Elena used to sit, half expecting to hear her steady voice, offering counsel on matters Serafina addressed instead with cold, practical logic. He pushed these thoughts aside whenever they surfaced, focusing instead on the demands of leadership that left little room for dwelling on choices already made, and, as far as anyone else within the pack understood, permanently settled. Far from the forests and stone halls of Blackthorn territory, Elena had begun the slow, deliberate work of building an entirely new life from nothing. Her first days in the city passed in a blur of practical necessity. She spent hours walking unfamiliar streets, learning the layout of a settlement far larger and more complex than anything she had encountered during her brief trade visits with pack delegations. She counted her remaining savings carefully each evening, aware that they would not stretch indefinitely, and began searching for work with the same disciplined focus she had once applied to combat training. Most establishments turned her away quickly, uninterested in hiring someone with no verifiable history or local references. Elena grew accustomed to polite refusals, to doors closing gently but firmly in her face, to the particular exhaustion of searching for purpose in a world that had no obligation to provide it. She found her opportunity nearly 2 weeks into her search, drawn by a simple handwritten sign taped inside the front window of a struggling logistics company called Harbor Freight Solutions. The building itself looked tired, its brick facade worn by years of weather, but something about the modest, unpretentious nature of the place appealed to Elena in ways the larger, more polished companies had not. The owner, a perpetually exhausted man named Nathan Bell, barely looked up from a mountain of paperwork when she stepped through his office door. "Can you handle spreadsheets?" he asked, more concerned with finding someone willing to work long hours for modest pay than conducting any thorough evaluation of her background. "Yes," Elena answered honestly. She had managed pack resources and supply records for years, coordinating complex logistics across multiple trading routes, though she offered none of this history to Nathan directly. "Can you start tomorrow?" "Yes," she said again. Nathan studied her for a moment longer, taking in her calm composure, the quiet confidence in her voice, despite obvious exhaustion visible beneath her carefully maintained exterior. "All right," he said finally, waving a hand toward the door. "Welcome aboard. Don't make me regret this." Elena's first weeks at Harbor Freight Solutions tested her in ways entirely different from anything pack life had prepared her for. Where physical strength and combat skill had determined much of her worth within pack structure, success here depended on organization, negotiation, and an endless stream of small decisions accumulating into larger outcomes over time. She learned quickly, staying late most evenings long after other employees had gone home, absorbing every detail of the business, from shipping logistics to client relationships to the delicate balancing act of managing limited resources against growing operational demands. Nathan noticed her dedication within the first month, watching with something approaching disbelief as she reorganized inefficient processes that had plagued the company for years, identifying solutions he himself had overlooked in his constant state of exhaustion. "You work harder than anyone I've hired in years," he told her one evening, as they both prepared to leave the office, long after everyone else had already gone home. "I have nothing else to focus on," Elena admitted, surprising herself with the honesty of the statement. Nathan did not press for further details, sensing correctly that Elena carried some private weight she was not yet ready to share with a stranger, however trustworthy he might eventually prove to be. Instead, he simply nodded and said, "Well, whatever brought you here, I'm glad it did. This company needed someone exactly like you." Elena found unexpected comfort in those words. For the first time since leaving Pact territory, she felt a small, genuine sense of purpose beginning to take root, something entirely separate from the identity she had lost the night of Damien's coronation. She was no longer simply the woman who had loved an Alpha King and been passed over in favor of someone else. She was becoming, slowly and deliberately, someone new, someone whose value existed independent of anyone else's approval or choice. The pain of that night did not disappear entirely, of course. It surfaced in quiet moments, late in the evening when the office grew silent and empty around her, or during rare instances when something reminded her too directly of home. A particular scent carried on the wind, the sound of laughter that echoed uncomfortably close to Damien's voice, the sight of a couple walking together, with the kind of easy familiarity she had once believed she would eventually share with him. During those moments, Elena allowed herself brief, private acknowledgement of her grief before pushing forward again, refusing to let it consume the fragile progress she had begun building. Harbor Freight Solutions began showing measurable improvement under her growing influence within the company. She reorganized shipping schedules to eliminate costly delays, negotiated more favorable rates with key suppliers, and identified new business opportunities that Nathan, buried too deeply in daily crisis management, had never had the bandwidth to pursue. Within 3 months, the company's finances had stabilized enough that Nathan offered her a meaningful raise, along with expanded responsibilities, trusting her professional judgment more thoroughly than he trusted his own on several important matters. "I don't know what I'd do without you," he admitted during a particularly successful week, after Elena secured a shipping contract that had seemed entirely out of reach just days earlier. Elena allowed herself a genuine smile, one that felt noticeably different from the careful, controlled expressions she had worn during her final days within Pact territory. "You'd figure it out," she said, "but I'm glad you don't have to find out the hard way." As the weeks continued passing, Elena's role within the company expanded steadily, and something in her began to change alongside it, quietly, gradually, in ways she would not fully recognize until much later, when the woman who had walked away from that coronation hall would feel almost like a stranger compared to who she was slowly becoming. 2 years passed, and Elena Cole had become someone her old self would barely recognize. Harbor Freight Solutions no longer existed under that name by the time those 2 years had run their course. Nathan's health had begun declining under the strain of running the company through difficult seasons, and one afternoon, he approached Elena with an offer that surprised her more than almost anything since her arrival in the city. "I want you to buy me out," he said, sitting across from her in the small office that had grown considerably busier over the past 2 years, its walls now lined with organized shelving and updated equipment that reflected the steady growth Elena's leadership had brought to the business. "You've built this company into something real, Elena. It deserves someone who can carry it forward, and my body has made it clear it isn't cooperating with that plan much longer." Elena stared at him, genuinely stunned by the offer. "I don't have that kind of money, Nathan." "You don't need all of it up front," he explained, sliding a folder across the desk toward her, papers inside, outlining a payment structure based on the company's projected growth under continued leadership. "I've thought this through carefully. If you're half as good as I believe you are, this arrangement works out for both of us." Elena spent that entire night reviewing the numbers Nathan had provided, weighing risk against opportunity, with the same careful, disciplined analysis she had once applied to combat strategy during Pact trials. By morning, she had reached her decision. She renamed the company Voss Dynamics, reclaiming the surname she had abandoned the night she fled Pack territory, though no one within the human world understood the significance woven into that choice. It felt important to her regardless, a quiet, private acknowledgement that she had not entirely erased her past, only transformed the pain of it into something considerably stronger. Under her leadership, Voss Dynamics grew at a pace that surprised even Elena herself. She possessed a rare instinct for identifying inefficiencies that competitors consistently overlooked, for cultivating relationships with clients who valued her directness and unwavering reliability, and for making difficult decisions without hesitation whenever circumstances demanded it. She hired carefully and thoughtfully, gradually building a small but fiercely loyal team of employees who respected her leadership and appreciated the genuinely fair treatment she extended toward everyone working under her. Priya, the bakery owner who had rented Elena her first room in the city, remained one of her closest friends throughout this remarkable transformation. The two women met regularly for coffee, whenever their schedules allowed, and Priya watched with quiet pride as Elena evolved from an exhausted stranger with careful, guarded eyes into a confident businesswoman, commanding genuine respect throughout the city's growing logistics sector. "You've changed so much," Priya observed during one of their regular meetings, studying Elena carefully, across a small table tucked into the corner of her bakery. "Is that a good thing?" Elena asked, though genuine uncertainty rarely colored her voice these days. "It's the best thing I've ever watched happen to anyone," Priya said firmly. "You walked in here looking like someone who had lost absolutely everything. Now look at you." Elena smiled, though something distant flickered briefly behind her eyes, a shadow of pain she still carried quietly, even after all this time had passed. "I did lose everything," she admitted. "I simply decided to build something new, instead of waiting around for someone to hand it back to me eventually." Priya reached across the table and squeezed her hand gently. "Whatever happened before you arrived here, whoever hurt you so deeply, they lost something far more valuable than they will ever fully understand. You should know that clearly, Elena." Elena nodded, genuinely grateful for the friendship that had become one of the few constants throughout her rebuilt life, though she still rarely spoke about the specific details of her past, even with someone as trusted as Priya. She kept the memory of Pack life and Damien's rejection carefully locked away in a private corner of herself, a place she had learned to manage rather than fully heal from over these past 2 years. Voss Dynamics continued its steady expansion throughout that second year, eventually catching the attention of considerably larger companies seeking reliable, trustworthy logistics partners for their increasingly complex supply chains. Elena negotiated contracts with a sharpness that repeatedly surprised competitors who had underestimated her, particularly those who assumed her relatively young age and the company's modest size meant she necessarily lacked serious business acumen. She proved these assumptions wrong again and again, securing agreements that gradually established Voss Dynamics as a legitimate and increasingly influential force within the broader industry. She built her professional reputation on principles she had carried with her, whether she consciously acknowledged it or not, from her years within Pack life: loyalty, fairness, and unwavering reliability that clients and employees alike came to depend on completely. Her team respected her deeply, not only for her sharp business instincts, but for the genuine care she consistently showed toward their individual well-being, remembering perhaps too clearly herself what it felt like to be discarded and overlooked by someone who should have valued her more. One evening, following the successful closure of a particularly significant contract that would triple the company's overall shipping capacity within the coming year, Elena sat alone in her office, long after her employees had gone home for the night, staring out at city lights spreading endlessly beyond her window. She thought, as she sometimes still did during quiet moments like this one, about the life she had left behind entirely, about the Pack, about Damien, about the earlier version of herself who had once genuinely believed her worth depended completely on being chosen by someone else. That earlier version of herself felt impossibly distant now, almost like a memory belonging to a completely different person. Elena did not know, even now, whether she had truly healed from what happened that night in the coronation hall, or whether she had simply buried the pain deeply enough beneath layers of ambition and relentless hard work that it no longer held meaningful power over her daily life. Either way, she had built something entirely real, something unmistakably her own, and she refused to let anyone ever take that away from her again. She thought sometimes, though less frequently than she once had, about Marcus, wondering whether he had ever attempted to search for her, wondering how the pack had truly fared under Serafina's continued leadership. She thought even less often, though not never, about Damien himself, about whether he still wondered occasionally what had become of her, or whether he had simply moved forward with his life, exactly as thoroughly as she had moved forward with hers. She told herself, as she often did during these late evening moments of reflection, that such thoughts no longer mattered. She told herself firmly that she had built a life that no longer required any answers from a world she had deliberately chosen to leave behind entirely. But late at night, when the city outside grew quiet and her office suddenly felt too large and too empty around her, Elena sometimes wondered whether she would ever truly escape the shadow cast by that single devastating moment, standing in a crowded hall, while the man she had loved chose someone else in front of everyone she had ever known throughout her entire life. She pushed those particular thoughts aside quickly, as she nearly always did, redirecting her focus back toward the growing empire she had constructed from absolutely nothing but sheer determination and an unwavering refusal to be permanently broken. Whatever the future ultimately held for her, she intended to face it entirely, as the woman she had become through years of relentless work, not as the girl who had once waited quietly and patiently for a crown that had never truly been meant for her in the first place. Voss Dynamics continued its rapid, steady growth into the following year, eventually catching the kind of attention that would soon bring Elena's carefully separated worlds crashing together in ways she never could have possibly anticipated during those early, uncertain months of rebuilding. Within Pack territory, the years following the coronation had not been kind to Serafina's leadership, though the cracks appeared slowly enough that most Pack members did not fully register the pattern until considerable damage had already accumulated. At first, her reign appeared genuinely strong. She impressed the Elder Council with her sharp strategic mind, securing several favorable trade agreements with neighboring packs and strengthening Blackthorn's political standing across the wider region during her early months as Luna. But strength built primarily on calculation, rather than genuine connection, tends to weaken gradually over time, and slowly, persistently, cracks began appearing throughout the pack that Serafina struggled increasingly to repair, or even fully acknowledge. Pack members who had once respected Elena's warmth and evident fairness found themselves quietly comparing Serafina unfavorably whenever particularly difficult decisions arose within the community. Where Elena had always taken careful time to understand every side of a conflict before rendering judgment, Serafina moved quickly and decisively, often without fully considering how her choices affected the pack's most vulnerable members. Complaints began reaching the Elder Council with increasing frequency, quiet grumblings that grew steadily louder as months accumulated into years of continued frustration. Damien noticed this gradual shift, though he struggled considerably to address it in any meaningful way. As Alpha King, he bore ultimate responsibility for the pack's overall well-being, and watching dissatisfaction grow beneath the surface troubled him more deeply than he readily admitted, even to himself. He spoke with Serafina about these mounting concerns on several separate occasions, encouraging her gently to soften her approach, to listen more carefully to pack members who felt increasingly unheard under her particular style of leadership. "I am doing what's genuinely best for this pack," Serafina would insist during these increasingly tense conversations, her tone growing more defensive with each passing exchange. "Strong leadership requires making difficult decisions. Not everyone will feel pleased with every single choice I make. There's a meaningful difference between difficult decisions and decisions made without sufficient care," Damien replied during one particularly tense exchange, nearly 2 years into their strained partnership. "This pack needs to feel that their Luna genuinely understands them, not simply that she governs over them from a distance." Serafina's expression tightened noticeably at his words, and something cold passed between them that would never fully disappear from their relationship afterward. "Perhaps you're comparing me to someone else entirely," she said quietly, her voice carrying an edge Damien recognized immediately and uncomfortably. He did not deny the implicit accusation. He could not honestly, though he genuinely wished he could offer her the reassurance she so clearly wanted from him in that moment. "Elena understood this particular pack differently than either of us fully do," he admitted carefully. "That's not meant as a criticism directed at you specifically. It's simply true, and I think we both know it. Marcus, meanwhile, had continued his own quiet investigation into Elena's whereabouts over these passing years, gradually gathering small pieces of information that painted an increasingly clear picture of her transformed new life. He learned about her steady work in logistics, about the company she had eventually taken over and renamed entirely, about her growing reputation within certain business circles, operating far beyond Pact territory's traditional boundaries. He shared relatively little of this gathered information with Damien directly at first, genuinely uncertain whether revealing it would help his troubled friend find some measure of peace, or simply reopen wounds that had never fully healed in the years since Elena's sudden departure. But as Pact tensions continued mounting steadily under Serafina's increasingly strained leadership, Marcus began wondering seriously whether the Pact's long-term stability depended on considerably more than simply finding better political strategies moving forward. He began wondering whether it depended instead on finally acknowledging difficult truths that Damien had spent years carefully avoiding confronting directly. One evening, nearly 3 years after Elena's original disappearance, Marcus finally decided the time had come to share what he had learned. He found Damien alone in his private study, staring intently at reports detailing yet another round of Pact complaints regarding Serafina's recent decisions about resource distribution among several struggling Pact families. "I need to tell you something important," Marcus said, closing the heavy study door firmly behind him. Damien looked up immediately, sensing the considerable weight behind his oldest friend's careful tone. "What is it, Marcus?" "I know where Elena is," Marcus said simply, watching his friend's reaction carefully. "I've actually known for over a year now. I wasn't entirely certain whether telling you would genuinely help or hurt matters, but given everything currently happening here within the Pact, I believe you deserve to finally know the complete truth." Damien's expression shifted rapidly through several distinct emotions in quick succession, surprise giving way to disbelief, and finally settling into something closer to desperate, carefully suppressed hope. "Where is she, Marcus? Tell me everything." Marcus explained everything he had carefully learned over the preceding months, describing the distant city she had eventually settled within, the modest company she had transformed from nothing into something genuinely impressive, the growing reputation she had steadily earned as a sharp and formidable businesswoman throughout human commercial circles. Damien listened in complete silence, absorbing every single detail with an intensity that told Marcus with certainty exactly how much this particular information still mattered to him, regardless of how many years had already passed since her sudden departure. "She built all of this entirely on her own," Damien said quietly, when Marcus finally finished speaking, the words directed more toward himself than toward his patient friend. "She left with absolutely nothing, and somehow built an entire empire from the ground up." "She always possessed that particular strength within her," Marcus said gently. "We simply never fully witnessed it before, because she spent so many years quietly supporting your personal ambitions, instead of ever pursuing her own genuine potential." The words struck Damien considerably harder than Marcus had perhaps originally intended, forcing him to finally confront an uncomfortable truth he had spent years carefully avoiding examining too closely. Elena had always been brilliant and remarkably capable, yet within the rigid confines of Pact structure, her true potential had remained largely overshadowed by her supporting role beside him. It had taken losing absolutely everything, being publicly discarded in front of the entire assembled Pact, for her genuine capabilities to finally emerge fully into a wider world that could properly recognize and value them. "I need to see her," Damien said finally, though even as he spoke those words aloud, he understood clearly how genuinely complicated that particular desire truly was, given his current circumstances. He remained Alpha King, bound tightly to responsibilities and to a mate he had formally chosen years earlier, however troubled and strained that particular partnership had gradually become over time. Seeking Elena out now carried implications extending far beyond simple curiosity or lingering personal guilt. "Be careful," Marcus warned seriously. "Whatever you're genuinely hoping to find by reaching out to her after all this time, remember clearly that she rebuilt her entire life without ever needing anything from this Pact, or from you specifically. She may not welcome your renewed presence the way you're currently imagining she might." Damien nodded slowly, understanding the caution embedded within his friend's careful words, even as something stubborn and increasingly determined settled firmly into his chest. He began quietly looking for legitimate reasons to reach out toward her, opportunities that would not appear overly desperate or entirely inappropriate given both his current position and his complicated history with her. It did not take particularly long before an opportunity presented itself quite naturally, arriving through routine pack business rather than through any obvious personal desire. The PAC's logistics network, responsible for managing trade agreements and resource distribution across several allied territories, had been struggling noticeably with inefficiencies for many months. Advisors within the Elder Council suggested seeking outside professional expertise to help modernize their aging systems, and during one routine business review, a single company name kept surfacing repeatedly among the recommended logistics partners currently operating within the broader region. Voss Dynamics. Damien stared at the company name printed clearly on the report before him, understanding immediately that fate, or perhaps simply inevitable circumstance, had presented him with precisely the opportunity he had been quietly searching for. He would not need to explain awkward personal motivations or complicated shared history to anyone. He could approach Elena purely through legitimate business channels, under the reasonable guise of genuine pack necessity rather than obvious personal longing. He authorized the PAC's business representatives to formally schedule a meeting with Voss Dynamics, requesting that he personally attend the discussions, given the considerable significance of this potential partnership for the PAC's future stability. Marcus, upon learning of this particular decision, said nothing further to discourage him, though visible concern remained clearly present in his careful expression throughout the following days. The morning of the scheduled meeting arrived, with a light rain falling steadily over the city, softening the sharp edges of tall buildings and painting every street below with pale reflections of gray sky. Elena arrived at her office earlier than her usual routine, reviewing details of the upcoming negotiation with characteristic careful attention. The client's territory remained deliberately vague within the paperwork she had received, described only as a private regional network seeking modernized logistics support, but the potential contract value was significant enough to warrant her complete attention regardless of the client's somewhat unusual secrecy about their exact identity. Her assistant, a sharp and capable young woman named Grace, who had worked closely alongside Elena for nearly a year now, poked her head carefully into the office just before the scheduled meeting time arrived. "They're here," Grace said. 3 representatives total, very formal in their manner. One of them clearly seems to be in charge of the delegation. Elena nodded, straightening papers on her desk and smoothing the front of her tailored jacket with practiced efficiency. She had learned long ago through hard experience that first impressions mattered enormously within business negotiations, and she always ensured she appeared composed and thoroughly professional, regardless of whatever circumstances surrounded a particular meeting. "Send them in, please," she said. Grace disappeared briefly, and moments later, the door to Elena's office swung open. The first 2 representatives entered first, older men Elena did not immediately recognize, dressed formally in dark attire that seemed slightly incongruous against the modern, minimalist aesthetic of her carefully designed office space. She rose from her chair to greet them properly, offering polite handshakes and professional smiles, her attention already beginning to shift toward reviewing the negotiation points she had thoroughly prepared in advance. Then the third figure stepped through the doorway behind them, and Elena's entire body went completely still. Damien. He looked noticeably different than she remembered him, older now, more visibly weathered by years of accumulated leadership responsibility, but unmistakably, undeniably himself, in every essential way that mattered. His eyes found hers immediately across the room, and for a long, suspended moment, neither of them moved or spoke a single word. The 2 older representatives glanced between them with visible confusion, clearly sensing a tension neither of them fully understood or could reasonably explain. Elena recovered first, drawing deeply on years of hard-won, practiced composure that had successfully carried her through countless difficult business negotiations before this one. She extended her hand toward him with the same professional courtesy she had already offered the others, though her heartbeat had quickened considerably to a pace that made maintaining that outward composure significantly more difficult than it likely appeared to anyone watching. "Mr. Cross," she said evenly, deliberately using his surname rather than any title that might reveal their shared history to the visibly confused representatives standing nearby. "Welcome to Voss Dynamics." Damien took her offered hand, his grip firm but noticeably careful, as though he understood instinctively that any misstep in this particular moment could shatter the fragile professionalism Elena had so carefully constructed around herself. "Elena," he said quietly, her given name carrying weight that extended far beyond simple, polite greeting. "It's been a very long time." "It has," she agreed, releasing his hand promptly and gesturing toward the chairs arranged neatly around her conference table. "Please, everyone, sit down. Let's discuss what exactly brought you all here today." The meeting that followed tested every single ounce of professional discipline Elena possessed within her. She presented detailed logistics solutions with her usual sharp clarity, answered technical questions from the two older representatives with confident, thorough expertise, and carefully avoided any direct personal engagement with Damien, beyond whatever business necessity strictly required of her. He, for his part, remained largely quiet throughout most of the technical discussions, allowing his representatives to handle the majority of detailed negotiations, while he simply observed Elena, with an intensity that made her acutely, uncomfortably aware of his presence throughout the entire lengthy meeting. When the discussion finally concluded, with both sides agreeing to carefully review the proposed terms before finalizing any formal partnership agreement, Elena walked her guests toward the office door with practiced professional efficiency, genuinely eager to end an encounter that had drained her considerably more than any negotiation she could readily remember from recent memory. The two older representatives departed first, moving briskly toward the elevator, while exchanging quiet, satisfied comments about the productive meeting they had just concluded. Damien lingered behind deliberately, and Elena found herself standing alone with him in the hallway outside her office for the first time in nearly 3 complete years. "You've built something truly remarkable here," he said quietly, his eyes taking in the busy, thriving office around them, the visible signs of genuine success and hard-earned stability that surrounded her on every side. "I built it because I needed to," Elena replied, keeping her tone carefully neutral, despite the storm building steadily beneath her composed exterior. "Was there something else you specifically needed, Mr. Cross?" Something flickered across his face at her deliberate use of formal address, a complicated mixture of visible hurt and reluctant understanding that he seemed to recognize as entirely justified given the painful circumstances of their shared history. "I wanted to see you," he admitted honestly, dropping the professional pretense entirely between them. "I've genuinely wanted to see you for a very long time now." Elena's jaw tightened noticeably, old buried pain surfacing, despite years of concerted effort to keep it firmly buried beneath professional composure. "You had years to seek me out if that were truly the case," she said. "Instead, you sent scouts who abandoned the search within mere weeks, and then you simply stopped looking for me altogether." "I never stopped caring about what happened to you," Damien said, his voice low and genuinely urgent. "I stopped believing I had any legitimate right to disrupt whatever new life you had chosen to build for yourself, but when this particular business opportunity arose unexpectedly, I found I couldn't possibly ignore the chance to finally see you again, to understand what had truly become of you after everything." "What became of me," Elena repeated slowly, a humorless smile touching her lips briefly, "is that I built an entire life without ever needing your approval or your attention again. I don't require any closure from you, Damien. I found my own closure a long time ago." She turned to walk back toward her office, but his voice stopped her firmly before she could reach the door. "I made a genuine mistake," he said quietly. "That night, choosing Serafina over you, it was a mistake I've deeply regretted for years now." Elena turned back slowly, studying his expression with careful, deliberate scrutiny, searching openly for any trace of genuine sincerity or subtle manipulation hidden within his words. "Regret doesn't change what actually happened," she said finally. "It doesn't undo the years I spent rebuilding myself from absolutely nothing, after you humiliated me in front of everyone I had ever known in my entire life." "I know that completely," Damien said. "I'm not asking you to forgive what happened between us. I'm simply telling you the honest truth, because you genuinely deserve honesty now, after everything I previously failed to give you." Elena held his gaze steadily, for a long, weighted moment, something complicated passing silently between them that neither fully understood or chose to acknowledge aloud in that instant. Finally, she nodded once, a small, carefully controlled gesture that revealed absolutely nothing of the storm building steadily beneath her calm exterior. If your pack wishes to proceed with this particular partnership, my team will handle all future communications professionally, she said firmly. I trust you can respect those clear boundaries. Damien nodded slowly, understanding completely the clear line she had just drawn between them. Of course, he said. Thank you sincerely for your time today, Elena. He turned and walked toward the waiting elevator, leaving Elena standing alone in the quiet hallway, her carefully maintained composure finally beginning to crack now that he could no longer directly see her face. She returned to her office, closed the door firmly behind her, and sat down heavily in her chair, staring at absolutely nothing in particular, while years of carefully buried emotion threatened to surface all at once, overwhelming and unexpected. Grace knocked softly, before entering a few minutes later, carrying a small stack of paperwork related to the meeting they had just concluded. She paused immediately upon seeing Elena's unusual expression, genuine concern replacing her typical professional focus. Are you all right? She asked carefully. I'm fine, Elena said, though her voice carried considerably less conviction than usual. That's simply someone from my past. Grace, sensing correctly that there was far more to this particular story than Elena was currently willing to share with her, simply nodded and set the paperwork down quietly on the desk. Well, whatever exactly happened between you two, he clearly still thinks about you constantly. I could see it plainly in how he watched you throughout that entire meeting. Elena said nothing in immediate response, though Grace's careful observation echoed uncomfortably within her mind, long after her assistant had finally left the office for the evening. She had spent years genuinely convincing herself that she had moved entirely beyond her old feelings for Damien, that the pain of his rejection had transformed completely into productive strength and ambition, with absolutely nothing remaining of the old wounds. Seeing him again unexpectedly, hearing his genuine admission of regret, had shattered that carefully maintained illusion, far more thoroughly than she wanted to honestly admit to herself. Over the following weeks, negotiations between Voss Dynamics and the Blackthorn Logistics Network continued through a careful series of formal meetings, each one requiring difficult navigation of professional boundaries that grew increasingly hard to maintain with each passing session. Elena delegated as much direct interaction with Damien as professionally possible, relying heavily on her capable team to handle routine communications, while she focused her own attention on the larger strategic elements of the developing partnership. But certain matters required her direct personal involvement, regardless of her private discomfort with the situation. Contract terms needed her final approval before moving forward. Complex logistics challenges required her specific technical expertise to resolve efficiently. And so, despite her genuine best efforts to minimize direct contact between them, Elena found herself in Damien's presence considerably more often than she would have honestly preferred. During one particularly tense negotiation session, held within a conference room overlooking the sprawling city skyline, the two of them found themselves briefly alone, while other representatives stepped out to carefully review updated contract documents. Rain streaked steadily down the windows outside, the entire city blurred and softened beyond the wet glass. You've been deliberately avoiding me, Damien observed quietly, finally breaking the heavy silence that had settled comfortably between them. I've been managing an important business partnership professionally, Elena corrected firmly, though they both clearly understood the distinction was considerably thinner than she genuinely wanted to admit aloud. There's a meaningful difference. Damien studied her carefully for a long moment, something thoughtful and deliberately careful crossing his expression. Can I ask you something personal? Elena hesitated briefly, then nodded once, bracing herself internally for whatever difficult question he intended to raise next. Why did you specifically choose logistics as your path? Of everything you could have possibly pursued in this entirely new world, why exactly this particular field? The question caught her genuinely off guard, unexpected in its relative simplicity, compared to the deeper, more painful conversations she had been quietly anticipating from him. I needed steady work when I first arrived here, she said honestly. It wasn't some grand, calculated choice at first, but I gradually discovered I was genuinely good at it, that I understood complex systems and operational efficiency in ways that came naturally to me. You always did possess that particular gift, Damien said quietly. I distinctly remember you managing pack resources during difficult seasons, finding creative solutions that no one else could see clearly. I should have properly recognized that talent deserved considerably more than simply supporting decisions I alone made as alpha. Elena's expression tightened slightly at this belated acknowledgement, old frustration surfacing, despite her continued efforts to remain fully composed. "You're right about that," she said simply. "You genuinely should have recognized it." The directness of her response seemed to catch him visibly off guard, though he did not attempt to argue against it. "I know I failed you in many significant ways, beyond just the single choice I made that fateful night," he admitted honestly. "I took your loyalty and steady support completely for granted, assuming you would always simply be there, without ever truly considering what you personally needed or wanted for your own future. That's the honest truth of it," Elena agreed, her voice remaining steady, despite the considerable weight of this particular conversation. "For years, I measured my entire worth by how useful I could be to you specifically, by how much I could support your personal ambitions and your political position. When you ultimately chose Serafina instead, it wasn't merely heartbreak I felt in that moment. It was the sudden, devastating realization that I had spent years building an entire identity dependent completely on someone else's approval of me." Damien remained silent for a long moment, genuinely absorbing the full weight of her carefully chosen words. "And now?" he asked finally, his voice quiet. "Now," Elena said, gesturing broadly toward the busy office surrounding them, toward the clear evidence of everything she had built entirely on her own terms, without anyone's assistance. "My worth doesn't depend on anyone else's approval but my own." Something in her firm tone left very little room for further argument or continued discussion on this particular matter, and Damien seemed to genuinely understand this, nodding slowly without pressing the issue further. The other representatives returned shortly afterward, and the negotiation resumed its formal, professional tone once again, though the private conversation that had passed between them lingered heavily in the air long after the meeting officially concluded. As weeks gradually turned into months, the partnership between Voss Dynamics and the Blackthorn Logistics Network solidified steadily into a significant, mutually beneficial business arrangement. Elena's considerable expertise dramatically improved the PAC's overall resource distribution efficiency, while the substantial contract further elevated Voss Dynamics' growing reputation within broader business circles throughout the region. Success followed success, in steady succession, and Elena found herself increasingly recognized throughout the entire industry as a formidable, genuinely innovative leader, worth watching closely. But growing success also brought increased public visibility, and increased visibility eventually reached ears within PAC territory that Elena had genuinely hoped would never learn anything about her carefully rebuilt new life. Serafina, monitoring the PAC's various business dealings with growing personal unease as Damien's involvement with the Voss Dynamics partnership continued expanding well beyond what seemed strictly necessary for a standard business relationship, began investigating the company and its owner considerably more thoroughly than usual. What she ultimately discovered troubled her deeply and personally. Elena Cole was, in fact, Elena Voss, the very woman who had once loved Damien, who had disappeared entirely the night of Serafina's own coronation as Luna, had resurfaced years later, as a successful businesswoman, now deeply entangled with PAC operations, through an expanding logistics partnership that Damien personally oversaw, with clearly unusual dedication and attention. Serafina confronted Damien directly about this troubling discovery during a private conversation held late one evening, her voice carrying barely controlled anger beneath a thin veneer of practiced calm. "Did you already know?" she demanded sharply. "Did you know that Voss Dynamics belonged to Elena when you first approved this entire partnership?" Damien did not attempt to deny the accusation. "Yes," he admitted simply. "I knew from the very beginning." "And you genuinely didn't think this was information worth sharing with your own mate?" Serafina's voice rose noticeably, frustration and genuine hurt breaking through her usual careful control over her emotions. "I didn't know how to properly explain it to you," Damien said honestly. "The partnership itself benefits this PAC significantly, entirely regardless of any personal history existing between Elena and myself." "That's not remotely the point, and you know that perfectly well," Serafina snapped back. "You've been meeting with her regularly, working closely alongside her for months now, and you never once thought to mention that this particular woman was the very same person you rejected years ago in order to choose me instead." Damien remained silent, genuinely uncertain how to address her sharp accusation without further damaging an already deeply strained relationship that had been quietly struggling for years beneath a surface of political convenience, rather than any genuine emotional connection between them. I think, Serafina continued, her voice growing noticeably colder and more calculated with each word, that you have never truly let go of her, despite absolutely everything that has happened between us. And I think this particular partnership is far more personal in nature than you are currently willing to honestly admit, even to yourself. She left the room abruptly before Damien could formulate any adequate response, leaving him alone with uncomfortable truths he had spent years carefully avoiding, fully acknowledging, even to himself in private moments. Serafina's sharp accusation, however painful it was to directly confront, carried considerably more accuracy than he genuinely wanted to accept. Serafina moved carefully over the following weeks, gathering additional information about Elena's business dealings and personal history with the same calculated precision she typically applied to complex pack politics. She understood clearly that any direct confrontation would appear obviously motivated by simple jealousy, so instead, she began quietly cultivating relationships with certain business contacts who might eventually prove useful in undermining Voss Dynamics' rapidly growing reputation. She found her opportunity through a journalist named Oliver Finch, who wrote regularly for a respected business publication covering emerging companies and industry leaders throughout the wider region. Serafina approached him under a carefully constructed pretense, presenting herself as a concerned business partner possessing valuable insider knowledge about Voss Dynamics' rapid, potentially unstable growth pattern. There are legitimate questions worth asking about how quickly this particular company expanded, Serafina suggested during a private meeting with Oliver, choosing her words with practiced, deliberate care. And about the actual background of the woman leading it. Elena Cole isn't even her real given name, you know. Oliver, genuinely intrigued by the tantalizing possibility of an exclusive story, began investigating further on his own, gradually uncovering pieces of Elena's carefully guarded history that she had deliberately kept separate from her public business identity. He learned about her sudden disappearance from a private community years earlier, about the deliberate name change, about circumstances that, when framed strategically in a particular way, could suggest instability or intentional deception, rather than simple, legitimate personal reinvention. The resulting article, when it finally published, painted Elena in a distinctly unflattering light, questioning her fundamental transparency as a business leader and strongly suggesting that a woman who had once abandoned her entire community, under mysterious circumstances, might not genuinely deserve the considerable trust so many companies had already placed in her professional judgment and leadership. Elena read the damaging article in her office early one morning, Grace standing anxiously nearby as her employer's expression grew increasingly tense with each paragraph she absorbed. "This is completely unfair," Grace said, genuine outrage evident in her voice. "They're deliberately twisting your story into something ugly and misleading." Elena set the article down slowly, her jaw tight, but her outward composure remarkably steady, despite this clear, calculated attempt to damage everything she had worked so hard to build. "Someone specifically wanted this published," she said quietly. "This particular level of detail about my private past isn't something a journalist simply stumbles upon by pure accident." She suspected immediately who might be genuinely responsible, though she possessed no direct proof beyond simple instinct and her intimate understanding of pack politics that had once formed a central part of her daily life. The timing, coinciding so closely with the deepening partnership between Voss Dynamics and Blackthorn Territory, seemed entirely too convenient to be simple coincidence. Rather than panicking or attempting to hide defensively from the growing public scrutiny, Elena made a bold decision that genuinely surprised even those closest to her within the company. She called a press conference entirely of her own choosing, deliberately choosing complete transparency over defensive denial or evasion. Standing confidently before a room full of journalists and business analysts 2 days after the original article's damaging publication, Elena spoke with the same calm confidence that had successfully carried her through countless difficult negotiations over the preceding years. "I left a genuinely difficult personal situation years ago and built an entirely new life for myself," she said clearly, her voice remaining steady despite the considerable vulnerability of publicly acknowledging details she had carefully kept private for so long. "I changed my name because I needed meaningful distance from painful circumstances, not because I ever intended to deceive anyone about my legitimate business dealings or professional integrity. Everything I have built at Voss Dynamics reflects honest work, fair business practices, and genuine commitment to the clients and employees who have trusted me completely throughout this journey. She continued speaking, addressing pointed questions from the assembled press with unflinching honesty, acknowledging her difficult past without providing excessive personal details that rightfully remained private. Her remarkable transparency, rather than further damaging her reputation as intended, generated considerable public sympathy instead. Many observers openly admired her genuine courage in facing difficult questions directly, rather than hiding behind lawyers or evasive corporate statements. The overall narrative shifted rapidly, following her decisive press conference. Business analysts began questioning instead who had originally motivated the damaging article, why such detailed personal history had been specifically leaked during this particular period of Voss Dynamics' partnership negotiations with an outside regional network. Growing suspicion began turning instead toward unknown sources potentially connected to that very network itself. Oliver Finch, facing mounting professional pressure regarding his original sourcing for the story, eventually revealed, under increasing scrutiny, that a woman claiming legitimate insider business knowledge had approached him directly with the damaging information, though he had not previously verified her true identity or underlying motivations beyond her stated claims of genuine concern. Within PAC territory itself, whispers began circulating steadily about Serafina's likely involvement, fueled partly by Marcus, who had grown deeply suspicious of both the timing and the calculated nature of this attack against Elena's hard-earned reputation. He quietly investigated the probable connection himself, eventually confirming enough solid evidence to bring his serious concerns directly before the Elder Council. The eventual revelation that Serafina had personally orchestrated a public attack against a respected business partner, purely out of personal jealousy and deep insecurity regarding her own precarious position, damaged her standing within the PAC far more severely than any accusation from Elena's press conference could have possibly caused on its own. Elders who had already grown increasingly uneasy about her cold, calculated leadership style found this troubling confirmation of manipulative behavior deeply disturbing, raising serious questions about her fundamental judgment and continued suitability to serve as Luna. Serafina, confronted directly by the Elder Council regarding the mounting evidence against her, refused to fully acknowledge her clear involvement, though her defensive, evasive responses only strengthened growing suspicions, rather than easing them in any meaningful way. Damien, learning of Serafina's calculated actions through Marcus's careful, thorough investigation, felt a genuinely complicated mixture of righteous anger and something close to painful vindication regarding doubts he had long privately harbored about her true character and leadership judgment. He confronted her directly and firmly, demanding complete honesty about her role in the attempted sabotage of Elena's hard-earned reputation. "I did what I genuinely believed was necessary to protect this PAC's interests," Serafina said finally, her practiced composure cracking noticeably under the weight of Damien's unwavering direct gaze. "That woman's growing influence over you personally, over PAC business dealings, over everything we've supposedly built together, it was becoming genuinely dangerous to everything we've established. You deliberately attacked an innocent woman's reputation out of pure jealousy," Damien said, his voice carrying barely restrained fury beneath the surface. "This has absolutely nothing to do with protecting the PAC, and everything to do with protecting your own deep insecurities." Serafina had no adequate response to offer in her own defense, and this direct confrontation marked a genuinely decisive turning point in their already fractured partnership. Within just a few weeks, formal discussions began within the Elder Council regarding Serafina's continued suitability to serve as Luna, discussions that would ultimately determine the entire future direction of PAC leadership going forward. In the weeks following the direct confrontation with Damien, Serafina's position within Blackthorn territory continued deteriorating rapidly and steadily. The Elder Council, having lost considerable confidence in her overall judgment following the damaging revelation of her manipulative tactics against an innocent business partner, began openly discussing the genuine possibility of removing her from her position as Luna entirely, a decision that carried significant weight within long-standing PAC tradition and had not been made lightly by the Council in many generations. Serafina fought desperately to salvage her rapidly declining standing, attempting to demonstrate renewed commitment to fair, thoughtful leadership through a careful series of public gestures specifically designed to rebuild trust among skeptical PAC members. But the considerable damage proved genuinely difficult to repair at this late stage. Years of accumulated resentment over her cold, calculated approach to overall governance, combined with the recent scandal directly involving Elena, had eroded confidence too thoroughly for surface-level gestures alone to reverse the damage. Damien, watching this painful unraveling unfold before him, found himself confronting difficult truths about his own personal role in the entire situation. He had originally chosen Serafina years earlier, based largely on political convenience, genuinely believing that a strategic alliance between PACs mattered considerably more than authentic emotional connection. That fateful choice had shaped years of increasingly strained partnership, ultimately contributing directly to the very instability now seriously threatening overall PAC unity. He met privately with Marcus late one evening, seeking genuine counsel from the trusted friend who had known him longest and understood his true character better than almost anyone else within PAC territory. "I made a serious mistake years ago," Damien admitted, staring quietly into the fireplace burning steadily within his private study. "Not merely choosing Serafina over Elena, but choosing calculated political strategy over basic honesty in every decision I made that fateful night. I convinced myself that clever political maneuvering mattered more than genuine human connection, and I've spent years now living with the difficult consequences of that particular choice." Marcus listened patiently and carefully, understanding that his troubled friend genuinely needed space to work through emotions he had suppressed for far too long already. "What exactly do you intend to do now?" he asked finally. "I honestly don't know yet," Damien admitted. "The council will likely vote soon to formally remove Serafina from her position, given everything that has happened recently. When that eventually occurs, I'll need to carefully consider the PAC's future leadership direction." "And what about Elena?" Marcus asked directly, watching his friend's careful expression closely. Damien's jaw tightened noticeably at this direct question. "Elena has built an entire life, completely separate from PAC politics," he said. "I have absolutely no right to simply assume she would want any part of returning to this particular world, regardless of what ultimately happens with Serafina's current position." "You could always simply ask her directly," Marcus suggested simply, rather than assuming her likely answer before ever giving her a genuine chance to respond honestly. Damien considered this thoughtful advice carefully over the following days, as PAC politics continued shifting rapidly around him. The Elder Council formally voted to remove Serafina from her position as Luna within just 2 weeks, citing repeated serious concerns about her overall leadership style, culminating directly in the recent scandal that had damaged the PAC's hard-earned reputation and integrity among important business partners and allied territories. Serafina, faced directly with this formal removal, ultimately chose to leave Blackthorn territory entirely rather than remain within a community that had so thoroughly rejected her leadership. Her eventual departure marked the definitive end of a partnership that had never truly succeeded in building the genuine connection necessary for lasting PAC unity, despite years of careful political calculation specifically designed to ensure exactly that particular outcome. With Serafina's departure now finalized, Damien found himself facing a genuinely uncertain future, as Alpha King, without any Luna, solely responsible for guiding critical PAC decisions during a period of significant transition and lingering uncertainty. The Elder Council, sensing his obvious internal struggle, encouraged him to take adequate time before rushing hastily into any new political alliance or partnership decision. During this important period of reflection, Damien finally allowed himself to fully confront feelings he had spent years carefully avoiding examining too closely. He thought constantly about Elena, about the remarkable strength and integrity she had demonstrated throughout the recent damaging scandal, about the impressive empire she had built entirely through her own determination and considerable skill. He thought carefully about the significant mistake he had made years earlier, choosing political convenience over genuine connection, and about whether any possibility remained of correcting that fundamental mistake now, years later, given everything that had genuinely changed between them. He decided, finally, that regardless of how Elena might ultimately respond, he needed to speak with her honestly and directly, without the protective barrier of formal business negotiations or official PAC representation standing between them. He needed to offer the sincere apology and complete honesty she had genuinely deserved years earlier, regardless of whatever outcome that difficult conversation might ultimately bring. He traveled to the city entirely alone, without any pack escorts or formal announcements, arriving unannounced at the Voss Dynamics headquarters on a quiet afternoon that carried none of the formal weight of their previous business meetings together. Grace, recognizing him immediately from his previous visits, studied him with visible surprise. "Mr. Cross," she said carefully, "Elena doesn't currently have any meetings scheduled with your team today." "I'm not here for business matters," Damien said honestly. "I need to speak with her personally, if she's genuinely willing to see me." Grace hesitated briefly, clearly uncertain how exactly to proceed given the complicated history she had gradually learned existed between her employer and this unexpected visitor. Finally, she nodded once and disappeared into Elena's office, returning moments later with an expression that revealed relatively little about what had transpired during their brief private exchange. "She'll see you," Grace said simply, gesturing toward the closed office door. Damien entered slowly and carefully, finding Elena standing near her large window, looking out over the sprawling city she had built her entire new life within, her expression genuinely unreadable as she turned to face him directly. "I heard about Serafina," she said before he could even speak first, her voice carefully neutral. "The Elder Council's formal decision, her subsequent departure from Pack territory entirely. Word travels remarkably quickly, it seems," Damien observed. "I still maintain a few old contacts within Pack circles," Elena replied. "Old habits, I suppose, staying informed about a world I once genuinely belonged to." Damien studied her carefully for a long moment, searching for the right words to properly convey everything he had traveled here, specifically intending to say. "I came here to apologize," he said finally, "not for any business reasons, not because of any partnership between our respective companies. I came because you genuinely deserved honesty and basic respect years ago that I completely failed to give you, and I need you to fully understand how deeply I regret that particular failure." Elena remained silent, watching him carefully, patiently waiting for him to continue speaking. "I chose Serafina because I convinced myself that political strategy mattered more than genuine connection between us," Damien continued. "I told myself that effective leadership required sacrificing personal feelings for practical necessity. But that fateful choice cost me the one person who understood me most completely, who supported me most genuinely, without ever asking for anything meaningful in return, except basic honesty I never actually gave her." "You're right that you never gave me honesty," Elena said quietly. "For years, I genuinely believed we shared something real between us, something that would eventually lead somewhere meaningful together. Instead, I learned in front of the entire assembled pack that whatever connection I believed existed between us meant absolutely nothing when weighed against simple political convenience." "I know that now," Damien said. "I can't possibly undo that terrible night, or the years of pain it directly caused you. But I needed you to know clearly that walking away from you was the single greatest mistake of my entire life, one I've genuinely regretted every single day since it happened." Elena took a slow, deliberate breath, processing the considerable weight of his words, years of carefully buried emotion surfacing despite her genuine efforts to maintain composure. "I built this entire life without ever needing your approval or apology," she said finally. "I don't regret leaving that night, Damien. Leaving genuinely saved me from becoming someone who measured her entire worth through your choices alone." "I fully understand that now," Damien said. "I'm not asking you to regret leaving, or to return to a life you have clearly outgrown completely. I'm simply telling you the honest truth, because you genuinely deserve that much after everything I previously failed to give you." The office remained silent for a long, weighted moment, both of them standing amid years of accumulated shared history and unresolved emotion, genuinely uncertain exactly what came next in a difficult conversation that had already been years overdue between them. Elena walked slowly back toward her desk, needing physical distance to properly process the considerable weight of everything Damien had just openly admitted to her. She sat down carefully, folding her hands together in a gesture that reminded her uncomfortably of that terrible night years ago, standing in the coronation hall trying desperately to maintain her composure, while her entire world shifted irrevocably beneath her. "Why now?" she asked finally, looking up directly at him. "Why come here, and say all of this specifically now, after so many years of complete silence?" Because I finally stopped pretending that political convenience mattered more than basic truth, Damien said. Losing Serafina's position, watching pack unity nearly collapse entirely under leadership built on cold calculation, rather than genuine care, it forced me to finally confront everything I had avoided examining for years. I realized clearly that the genuine strength this pack needs, the strength I personally need, was never truly about strategic alliances or careful political positioning. It was always about honesty and authentic connection, the kind I once genuinely had with you and carelessly threw away. Elena listened carefully, weighing his heartfelt words against years of hard-won independence and genuine self-worth she had built entirely separate from pack politics or Damien's approval. "I appreciate your honesty," she said finally. "But I need you to understand something very clearly. I am not the same person who once waited quietly and patiently for you to choose her. I built Voss Dynamics because I refused to ever let anyone else's decisions define my worth again. I would never want you to become anyone other than exactly who you have become through your own efforts." "Then what exactly are you asking of me?" Elena said, her voice remaining steady despite the genuine vulnerability the question carried with it. Damien took a slow, careful breath, understanding fully that this particular moment required complete honesty rather than vague gestures toward eventual reconciliation. "I'm not asking for anything you aren't genuinely ready to give," he said. "I came here specifically to apologize, to be honest with you, about years of genuine regret, and to tell you that whatever happens next between us, whether that simply means continuing our business partnership professionally, or something considerably more, the choice belongs entirely to you alone. I have absolutely no right to expect or demand anything from you, after everything that happened between us previously." Elena studied him carefully, searching for any subtle trace of manipulation or calculated strategy hidden within his words, finding instead something that genuinely appeared to be authentic vulnerability, a man finally willing to openly acknowledge his mistakes, rather than continuing to hide behind position or political convenience. "I need some time," she said finally. "Years passed between that terrible night and this particular conversation. I can't simply erase everything that happened just because you finally decided to be honest about your regrets." "I completely understand," Damien said. "Take whatever time you genuinely need. I'm not asking you to decide anything today, right now." He turned to leave, but paused briefly at the door, looking back at her with an expression that carried none of the calculated confidence she remembered from years earlier as Alpha King, only genuine, uncertain hope. "For what it's worth," he added quietly, "watching you build absolutely everything you've built here, entirely through your own strength and determination, it's genuinely the most impressive thing I have ever personally witnessed. You deserved considerably better than what I gave you, but you never actually needed me to become who you are today. That achievement belongs entirely to you alone." He left without waiting for any response, understanding clearly that Elena needed adequate space to process everything that had just transpired between them. Elena remained alone in her office long after he had gone, staring at the door he had walked through, turning his heartfelt words over carefully within her mind. She spent the following weeks focused primarily on important business matters, using the demanding pace of running Voss Dynamics as a welcome distraction from the genuinely complicated emotions Damien's unexpected visit had stirred deeply within her. She spoke with Priya about the entire situation during one of their regular coffee meetings, seeking valuable perspective from the trusted friend who had personally witnessed her complete transformation since first arriving in the city years earlier. "What do you genuinely want?" Priya asked directly, watching Elena carefully across their small table. "I honestly don't know," Elena admitted truthfully. "Part of me wants absolutely nothing to do with him, wants to protect everything I've carefully built without risking that hard-won stability by revisiting old wounds. But another part of me remembers clearly who he used to be before politics and pressure fundamentally changed him, remembers the genuine connection we once shared before everything eventually fell apart between us." "You don't have to decide immediately," Priya reminded her gently. "You've spent years building genuine patience and careful decision-making into everything you do professionally. Simply apply that same hard-won wisdom here." Elena nodded, genuinely grateful for her friend's steady, thoughtful counsel. Over the following weeks, she continued running her company with characteristic focus and determination, while gradually allowing herself adequate space to genuinely consider what she truly wanted for her own future, separate entirely from either the pain of the past or the pressure of Damien's recent heartfelt apology. She thought carefully about the years since her original departure from Pact territory, about everything she had built and everything she had genuinely learned about her own strength and capability. She thought about Damien's apology, about the authentic vulnerability she had witnessed during their difficult conversation, and about whether reconciliation, in whatever particular form it might eventually take, represented genuine weakness, or simply another choice she remained entirely free to make on her own personal terms. Eventually, after several weeks of careful, honest reflection, Elena reached a decision that felt entirely her own, genuinely uninfluenced by old patterns of measuring her worth through someone else's approval or acceptance. She reached out to Damien directly, requesting a meeting that would take place entirely on her own terms, in her office, at a time entirely of her own choosing, addressing exactly the conversation she felt genuinely ready to have, rather than one shaped by his expectations or timeline. Damien arrived at Elena's office exactly at the appointed time, dressed simply rather than in the formal attire he typically wore during official Pact business dealings. Grace greeted him at the entrance and led him directly to Elena's office without the usual delay of business preparation, sensing correctly that this particular meeting carried entirely different significance than their previous professional discussions together. Elena stood near her large window when he entered the room, the city stretching out endlessly behind her, in warm afternoon light. She turned to face him with calm, steady composure, the same quiet strength that had carried her successfully through every difficult moment since the night she had originally walked away from everything she had once known. "Thank you for coming," she said, gesturing toward the chairs arranged neatly near her desk. They sat facing each other directly, and for a brief moment, neither of them spoke, both genuinely understanding that whatever came next would ultimately determine the direction their complicated shared history would finally take moving forward. "I've spent the past several weeks thinking very carefully about everything you said to me," Elena began. "About your apology, about the years since we last knew each other honestly, about everything I've built here entirely on my own terms, without anyone's assistance. I completely understand if you've decided you want absolutely nothing further to do with me," Damien said quietly. "I came to terms with that genuine possibility before ever traveling here to speak with you directly." "That's not what I've ultimately decided," Elena said, and something in Damien's expression shifted immediately at her words, cautious hope quickly replacing the resigned acceptance he had carried into this meeting. "But I need you to understand something very clearly before we discuss what genuinely comes next between us." "Anything at all," Damien said. "I am not the same woman who once measured her entire worth by whether you chose her," Elena said firmly. "I built Voss Dynamics into something genuinely significant, entirely through my own strength, my own decisions, my own hard-won resilience. Whatever happens between us now, whether that simply means continuing a respectful professional partnership or something considerably more personal, I need you to understand clearly that I will never again become someone who defines herself through another person's approval or acceptance. I would never want you to become that person again," Damien said, his voice carrying genuine sincerity. "Everything you've built here proves exactly why I regret the mistaken choice I made years ago. You genuinely deserved someone who recognized your strength and supported your ambitions from the very beginning, not someone who took years to finally understand what he had actually lost." Elena nodded slowly, absorbing his careful words thoughtfully. "I'm willing to explore what a genuine partnership between us might realistically look like," she said finally. "Not because I genuinely need you, or because returning to some earlier version of my old life would somehow complete me in ways I currently lack. I'm seriously considering this because, despite absolutely everything that happened, some part of the connection we once genuinely shared feels worth exploring honestly now, on equal terms this time, rather than the deeply unequal terms that existed between us years ago." "What would that genuinely look like, in practical terms?" Damien asked carefully, fully understanding that Elena's willingness came bundled with clear boundaries he needed to respect completely and without exception. "It means I remain exactly who I currently am," Elena said. "I continue running Voss Dynamics as its sole owner and leader. I don't return to Pact territory as someone's Luna. dependent entirely on pack structure or tradition to define my role or my worth. If we genuinely build something together moving forward, it exists as an authentic partnership between equals, built firmly on honesty rather than convenience or obligation. Damien considered her carefully chosen words thoughtfully, recognizing clearly the strength and clarity contained within them. "I can genuinely accept those terms completely," he said. "In fact, I believe those particular terms represent exactly the kind of relationship I should have offered you years ago, rather than simply assuming you would accept whatever role, tradition, and convenience happen to dictate for you." Elena allowed herself a small, genuine smile, the first real warmth she had shown him since his unexpected apology weeks earlier. "Then perhaps we can genuinely begin again," she said, "as two people who have both grown considerably since that terrible night, building something honest together, rather than simply repeating old patterns that never truly served either of us well." They spent the following hour discussing practical details together, how a genuine partnership between them might realistically function, given her demanding business responsibilities and his continued pack leadership obligations, how they might successfully navigate the complicated logistics of two genuinely demanding lives, without either person sacrificing their hard-won independence or personal identity for the sake of the other. The conversation carried none of the desperate urgency of their earlier encounters together, instead settling comfortably into something calmer and more deliberate, two genuinely capable people carefully constructing a solid foundation, built on mutual respect, rather than old, harmful assumptions. Over the following months, Voss Dynamics continued its remarkable, steady growth, expanding its logistics network to include several additional regional partnerships beyond the original agreement with Blackthorn Territory. Elena's reputation as a formidable, genuinely principled business leader only strengthened further, following the intense public scrutiny she had weathered with such genuine dignity, and companies throughout the entire industry increasingly sought her expertise and valuable partnership. Damien, meanwhile, worked steadily to rebuild pack unity following the turbulent transition away from Serafina's troubled leadership, carefully applying important lessons learned from his own past mistakes to govern with considerably greater honesty and genuine care for overall pack well-being. He visited Elena regularly, though always carefully respecting the clear boundaries she had established, fully understanding that their relationship existed entirely on terms she controlled completely, rather than terms dictated by his position or his own personal expectations. Marcus watched this careful, deliberate reconciliation unfold with quiet satisfaction, genuinely relieved to see his oldest friend finally choosing honesty over calculation, and pleased to witness Elena's continued strength and independence, even as she gradually allowed authentic connection back into her carefully rebuilt life. One evening, nearly a full year after their initial reconciliation conversation, Elena stood at the same office window where she had once watched rain falling steadily over the city, contemplating everything that had genuinely changed since that difficult, uncertain period following Damien's unexpected reappearance in her life. She thought carefully about the woman she had been that terrible night in the coronation hall, humiliated and heartbroken, genuinely believing her entire future had already been decided by someone else's careless choice. That particular woman felt impossibly distant now, replaced entirely by someone who had built an impressive empire through her own determination, who had weathered intense public scrutiny with genuine dignity and emerged considerably stronger, who had chosen, entirely on her own terms and in her own time, to allow authentic connection back into her life, without ever sacrificing an ounce of the independence and strength she had fought so hard to build. Damien entered the office quietly, finding her lost thoughtfully in reflection near the window. He said nothing at first, simply standing beside her, watching the city lights slowly beginning to illuminate the darkening evening sky together. "Do you ever genuinely regret leaving?" he asked finally, breaking the comfortable silence that had settled between them. Elena considered the thoughtful question carefully before finally answering. "No," she said honestly. "Leaving taught me exactly who I was genuinely capable of becoming, without depending on anyone else's approval. Everything I built here exists precisely because I refused to let that single night define my entire worth." "And now?" Damien asked. "Do you genuinely regret allowing me back into your life?" Elena turned to face him directly, something steady and genuinely certain settled deeply within her expression. "No," she said again firmly. "Because this time, I am choosing this connection entirely freely, as someone who no longer needs anything meaningful from you, except honesty and genuine mutual respect. That represents an entirely different foundation than the one we originally started with, all those years ago. Damien reached for her hand gently, and Elena allowed the connection between them, fully understanding now that accepting his presence back into her life took absolutely nothing away from everything she had already built independently. She remained exactly who she had become, through years of genuine determination and resilience, an accomplished, deeply respected leader who commanded authentic authority within an entire industry she had transformed through sheer force of will alone. Whatever came next for them together, whether that eventually meant building something more permanent as partners, or simply continuing their careful, deliberate relationship built firmly on mutual respect, Elena understood clearly that her fundamental worth had never truly depended on his choice, then or now. She had built an entire empire from absolutely nothing but pure determination and a genuine refusal to be permanently broken by rejection, and that empire, along with the strong woman who had built it, remained entirely her own, regardless of who eventually chose to stand beside her. The city lights continued spreading out endlessly beyond the window, illuminating a genuine future Elena had built entirely through her own strength, a future that now included Damien, not because she genuinely needed him to complete her story, but because she had finally found someone truly worthy of standing beside the remarkable woman she had ultimately become.